This is lecture 28. I'm going to introduce this lecture by talking about the Nat Turner Rebellion. We referred to this in our last lecture. And then I'm going to segue into the Abolitionist Movement. Context for this: sectionalism, again pointing out just how different the South is, a slave society living side by side with a republic. Significance: this is the first large-scale slave insurrection in the 19th century South. It occurs in Southampton County, Southern Virginia, in the summer of 1831. Nat Turner was a slave who had previously escaped the plantation and then had voluntarily returned to the plantation, which is unusual. He was literate. He would preach to his fellow slaves. He had an epiphany at some point on the plantation whereby he believed his mission, sanctioned by God, was to free his people and take them to Spanish territory, Spanish Florida. He and a group of Confederates began to accumulate weapons. They had a stash of weapons, and they began to make plans. When these plans came to fruition in August of 1831, it began a very bloody couple of days in Southern Virginia. Nat and his Confederates literally moved through the villages there, or through the countryside, I should say, and killed every white person they encountered. Men, women, children, the elderly. They encountered men on the roads, on horseback or carriages, and killed them. And they simply sort of indiscriminately went from house to house, farmhouse to farmhouse, killing as many people as possible. Word did begin to spread of this catastrophe. On August 22nd, Turner's group was confronted by a local militia. There was a shootout, and Nat Turner's Confederates were reduced to about 20. Nat Turner disappeared. He went into the swamps there, nearby swamps, and he lived there for a couple of months. Presumably, he had associates that brought him subsistence. At any rate, he was finally captured in October and jailed. In November, the so-called confessions of Nat Turner were taken down by a journalist, and these formed the basis of our historical look into Turner's rampage, and they formed the basis of an excellent 20th century novel by William Styron called The Confessions of Nat Turner. I highly recommend it. Nat was tried in November, and then he was executed on November 11th. He was hung. As I recall, he was then dismembered, and his bones were ground into fine powder. I think there was something here to the effect that regardless of his professed Christianity, he would not rise again. Newspaper report at the time: a fanatic preacher by the name of Nat Turner, who had been taught to read and write and permitted to go about preaching in the countryside, was at the bottom of this infernal brigandage. Turner was artful, impudent, and vindictive, without any cause or provocation that could be assigned. This notorious case came about just as the abolitionist movement began to gain some steam. And I'm just going to mention a few of these abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison is probably the most important. He carried on a anti-slavery campaign from the time of Nat Turner all the way through the Civil War. He was a Bostonian, an irritable, irascible man, fervent in his anti-slavery fanaticism, I believe the state of Georgia took out a bounty on Garrison if someone would go to Boston and drag this abolitionist back down here so we could try him and maybe hang him for his troubles. A genuinely hated man throughout the South, also disliked in the North because he made Northerners feel guilty if they were not concerned with the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement. But his newspaper, The Liberator, continually from early 1830s all the way to through the Civil War, continued to vilify the South and to proclaim that Southerners were not only wrong, but they were sinful, and that they were all going straight to hell, and that in fact the United States would be better off if the Southern states would somehow miraculously separate from the rest of the country and drift off into the Caribbean or into the Atlantic. So let's talk about these abolitionists in more detail. Context, sectionalism, country breaking into two distinct halves. Another context, you could call abolitionism one of the long-term causes of the Civil War. Abolitionism arises during what some historians refer to as an era of reform. Here you have women's rights awakening. There's certain religious awakenings, the Second Great Awakening, I think it's called. Temperance societies, utopian societies, and so on and so forth. So abolitionism is part of this bigger era of reform. And of course, the significance is that it does drive North and South into separate camps and lays the groundwork intellectually and emotionally for the American Civil War. Garrison made a miraculous find in an escaped slave named Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been a slave in Maryland. He escaped to the North. I forget the details of how they met. Probably Douglass was attending an abolitionist rally, perhaps sponsored by Garrison. At any rate, Garrison soon learned that this very handsome and articulate escaped slave was quite a good orator. And this, of course, was a gold mine for Garrison. Here he could send out on the stage and on the speaking circuit an actual escaped slave who was remarkably articulate and well presented. This, of course, makes the argument for abolitionism all the stronger. I would encourage you to read Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of a slave. You can read this online. Just Google that title, and it'll pop up. I just want to read a couple of excerpts from the narrative of the life of a slave, so you get some idea of Frederick Douglass's young life before he escaped. He says, by far the larger part of the slaves know little of their age, or know as little of their age as a horse would. And it is the wish of most masters to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember ever meeting a slave who could tell me his birthday. Of course, slaves are not people, they're property. They have no more need for knowing their age than a pet would. Douglass goes on. He says, my father was a white man. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It was common custom in that part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children with their mothers at a very early age. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the child for the mother. Property or people. The children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers, and this is done too obviously to administer to their own lust and to make a gratification of their wicked desires. Here talking about the white slave masters. The children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers. That is, the white slave master is under no obligation to treat his offspring by slave women as anything other than slaves. He says the master is frequently compelled to sell this class of his slaves out of deference to the feelings of his white wife. This is very interesting. You can imagine the slave master's wife walks out onto the porch of the plantation home, and they're playing with her own children, or these little mulatto children that she knows perfectly well are the result of her husband's lust and sexual dalliances with slave women on the plantation. She's reminded of her husband's infidelities every time she looks at these children. Can you imagine the neighbors coming over for barbecue and seeing these young mulatto children that look just exactly like her husband? You can see why the mistress of the house would demand of her slave-owning husband that these children be sold off the property so that she's not daily reminded of her humiliation. Douglas goes on to talk about the diet and clothes for the slaves and just how Spartan they were. He says, the home plantation of my master had the appearance of a country village. All the mechanical operations for the farm were performed here: shoemaking and mending, blacksmithing, cart riding, coopering, weaving, grain grinding, all performed by the slaves. Self-sufficient, almost a sort of pre-capitalist economy. Sounds like a medieval manor in 14th century France. He says, all of my master's sons and sons-in-laws enjoyed the luxury of whipping the servants whenever they pleased. And this is very interesting. He says, when my master's slaves met the slaves of another master, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jebson's slaves contending that their master was the smartest and the most able of men. The slaves seemed to think that the greatness of their masters would somehow rub off on them. Talks about their food, cornmeal, boiled. They called it mush. He said this was put into a large wooden tray or trough and was set upon the ground. The children were then called, like piglets, to eat from this trough. He said he was sold to a mistress in Baltimore. He said slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I first got there, she was a pious, warm, tender-hearted woman. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, her tender heart became stone. Her lamb-like disposition gave way to the tone of a tiger. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. And indeed, Douglas becomes literate. He comes across the word abolition. He has no idea what it means. He looks it up in the dictionary and finds that it said the act of abolishing. Of course, that's of no help. And he sensed that this was a very dangerous word, a word he should never utter. He says that upon the death of his master, there was no will to take care of the disposal of his property. Therefore, all the slave tools, livestock, and all the plantations, livestock and tools and slaves, were lined up to be divided as property among the heirs. Douglas talks about getting in a fight with a white overseer whom he whipped. He said not a word was ever said about this, as of course the white overseer could not have it be known that an African-American slave had beaten him up. That would probably ruin his career. And then Douglas ends the book by talking about his escape. He says, I left my chains and succeeded in reaching New York without the slightest interruption of any kind. How I did so, by what means I adopted, what direction I traveled, what mode of conveyance, I must leave unexplained for the obvious reasons, not to tip off slave hunters. This is just an introduction, really, to abolitionism. When we get to the origins of the American Civil War, we're going to talk about perhaps the most dangerous of the abolitionists. That's John Brown. I believe Frederick Douglass said that he and Garrison could live for the slave, but that John Brown could die for the slave. So we'll talk about John Brown at a later time. He is probably the most famous of our abolitionists. Thank you.